Think for a moment, what brought you here today? Is it because someone you cared about died by COVID-19? Did a fellow nurse die by COVID-19? And sadly, I did a program last week, and 3 or 4 clinicians called in saying that they were there because their coworkers died. This is sad. This is affecting all of us in ways that we can't even identify. It goes too deep. So let's look at Module 1. What makes grief complicated in the midst of COVID-19? Here you'll learn about unresolved, intense grief, because this grief is due to separation distress because of the pandemic. That separation distress is very different than the experience of loss in any other type of death. So emotional grief reactions, you might hear from those who contact you. They may say that they're fearful that another family member may get COVID, get survivor guilt, bitter and angry about the system because they're keeping their loved ones away from those who are dying, distressed because they were not able to say a happy goodbye, a loving goodbye, a tearful goodbye, and loneliness due to physical distancing. Cognitively, they have counterfactual thinking about a possible alternative. If they did this, if only they did that, then something else would have happened, and maybe their loved one would not have died. They have trouble accepting the death because they were not there. I could not attend my father's funeral or attend all the rituals after his death because I was in the hospital. So I understand what it's like to have trouble accepting the death if you weren't there creating rituals and being a part of the funeral and mourning. Confused, trouble making decisions are all things that your family members might experience. Also, behavioral grief reactions, pacing, isolating themselves, losing things, looking at photos. But many people in the radio programs I've been doing is saying that they're keeping an altar because they can't go out and be with others who mourn. They're putting pictures around the house and photographs along with candle lighting, and that brings them comfort. Physical grief reactions could be difficulty catching one's breath. Sighing is very, very common. Decreased resistance to illness, they're catching colds, they don't have the energy, and they feel shaky on the inside. Spiritually, they may notice profound coincidences in actually hearing the deceased speak to them, and they attempt to find meaning in what happened. Their grief can become complicated. Another term for complicated grief is prolonged grief disorder. It's recently proposed change to the DSM as a formal diagnosis. Now, with the prolonged grief disorder, there is a diagnostic criterion, and the first is that the death had to occur at least a year ago, and your patient's going to be experiencing intense yearning. They're just preoccupied with the deceased to a clinical degree for at least the last month. And this impairment really goes beyond what you would expect from people who are grieving a loss in their religious or cultural context. And the symptoms are not better explained by a mental disorder. And these symptoms, at least 3 of these symptoms, must be to a clinically significant degree. Now, this slide is significant because at the end of this training, I'm going to take 8 different PowerPoint slides and see how you can personally apply some type of intervention based on identity disruption, disbelief, avoiding reminders, dealing with the pain, difficulty moving on with life, the numbness, feeling that life is meaningless, and intense loneliness. So I'll give you some tips on how to provide support to those who mourn based on these criterion. However, we must note that it's only 10% of the entire top population of those who are bereaved experience complicated grief. Not many do because they have their faith, their family, And for many, it's support groups online or journaling, simple things. Not everyone experiences complicated grief, but I wanted to start this webinar with an understanding of complicated grief because we simply do not know what will happen a year from now for all those who mourn a COVID-19 related death. Now, there is complicated grief therapy available through the Center for Complicated Grief, and studies show that through this therapy, your patients will understand and accept grief, they'll deal with their emotions, they'll plan for a future, have their relationships, healthy relationships, they'll be able to share their lost narrative, live with reminders, which is so difficult for many, and connect with memories or continue the bond with their loved one. Now, the pandemic shows similarities to natural disasters, so we predict that COVID-19, being that there is a similarity with natural disasters, that perhaps that 10% complicated grief might increase.